I'm so excited to talk about this book and to celebrate this book with you today. Let's get into it. I'm looking at it, I'm holding it. It's so big and beautiful. And this was a surprise to me, Sarah, because I went out on maternity leave in September last year. So when I got my copy and I opened it up, I know this was like a conversation, but I didn't know what the outcome was. There's all these colored pages in it, which is really beautiful.
Yes. We had a lot of conversations about it because the majority of the book does not need to be in color. But the stuff that needs to be in color needs to be in color. There were parts of the book on color use, color blindness, that it's really, really hard to get those concepts. If you haven't experienced them yourself, if you have the ability to experience that visually, it's a huge opportunity to really get a better understanding to the best you can of why that's important.
So I will share the quick version of my story, which is I started ATD in 2020, and we had talked internally about wanting to do an accessibility book. What does that mean? What does that look like? And as soon as we talked to you, you were like, oh, yes, I am. Well, I think that's how I'm remembering it. I'm pretty sure that you were like, yes, I will do this. But I'll pass it over to you for you to say why this book and just give us a little bit of a high level like background to you what this book is about.
When I talked to you all about the book, I had already thought about if I'm going to do this, this is how I want to do it. And so that conversation was like, yes, I absolutely will do it because this has to exist. Somebody has
Mhm.
to do it. But it was a huge, scary project. And I said, if I'm going to do it, then I want to make sure that it's not just Sarah talking about accessibility. The way that you can understand accessibility and inclusive design is to be able to hear that message and the stories from lots of different people. There are things you can do, and there are checklists you should have. But to really understand how to make better design decisions, you have to better understand people. And that requires listening. The success of this book really is at its core getting to learn from all of these different people directly and not through my lens and not through my filters. We worked really hard to ensure that everyone's individual voices were maintained.
It was so fun to be behind the scenes. And it's funny as I look back and laugh. I mean, things were really messy, really, really messy. We wanted to do this topic justice. And one fear of mine was like, wanting to make sure that you're covering like everything and anything. You don't want to leave anyone or any type of thing out. Like, how do you reach literally all learners and all of the things? That's where it can start to be really overwhelming. And you take a look at this book, and it's not overwhelming at all. It is so accessible. It's all of these small short stories. And that is not what it looked like in like the table of contents version when you're first building out like all of these different topics and subtopics that we want to make sure are addressed. It's amazing to see like how it progressed from scary and overwhelming to something that someone can hold and suddenly be like, oh my gosh, I'm doing that right now in my work setting. And I didn't realize that that might not be accessible for everyone. And I can change it right away by doing the recommendations at the very end of this page. I just
Yeah.
love it so much.
So I was the content editor, right? So I put together the outline. It's like, these are all the topics I want to make sure we cover. And here are the people that I think should be talking about them. People that I'd heard stories from that I thought had a very unique perspective. People who represented the diversity and the different types of things that we were trying to help people understand that had deep experience in those areas and often lived experiences in those areas. And I think when we talk about another design approach, which is storytelling, I can teach you so much more about a thing by telling you a story about it than describing everything to you about neurodivergence. All of the contributors wrote these really succinct stories, and that helps you get it. And then they said, okay, here's how this works in your work. And then
Mhm.
here's one thing you can start doing right now to like actually implement this. And so when we think about the structure of the book and how you use it, you get a lot of information in a very short period of time.
It starts off with how do you create an inclusive mindset? A lot of this is about like changing your mindset and expanding it. We do have some big picture buckets of how you've organized it. So I was thinking maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe we can tease out a story or two.
Okay, so the way that the book is structured is it's meant to think about training and performance support design at a very big picture level. It's focused towards teaching people. And the reality is that all of us at some point in time in our lives are teaching people something. Even if it's in a social media post or if it's in a PowerPoint or an email to someone. When I put this book together, I was thinking about structuring it from what are the big things that we actually need to know about teaching people. Accessibility does not equal disability. Accessibility equals access. But in order to provide access, you do have to understand that people have different disabilities. A lot of people have disabilities we don't even know about. That you'll never know about because they're never going to share with you. That first part of the book is setting up some framing and having really honest, genuine discussions about what this actually means. The next parts of the book are getting into, okay, what does that look like in a digital environment? Any kind of digital content, e-learning, that kind of stuff where it's more asynchronous and I'm creating PDFs and I'm creating images, and how do I write alt text and do image descriptions, that kind of thing. I believe the next part is the classroom.
Yep.
So thinking about facilitating in the classroom, but not just training, but also events, putting together a conference or a team event for your team at work. And then you get into the next part, which is virtual learning. And that is definitely much more prevalent now than it ever has been. The next chapter gets into just a short primer on standards and laws. And I intentionally put it where I put it in the book because I wanted folks to kind of get a sense of the environment and then talk about, okay, here are some of the laws that exist around this, not just in the US, but globally, and what that looks like.
Addressing that section as that can be intimidating and
Yeah.
confusing because it's not typically written for our community. We're not
And
software developers designing a
mhm.
website and thinking about accessibility in that way. It can be really overwhelming to try and translate it yourself.
The section on standards, if it's something that you don't quite understand or you think it's just for federal government employees and you're like, we don't do 508 or nobody with a disability is in my organization or whatever, that section will blow your mind because
Mhm.
that's not what the point is at all. Everyone has to understand how accessibility and inclusion plays a role in their own work. And I don't mean every person in training, I mean every person on the planet needs to understand how accessibility plays a role in your work, understand how inclusion plays a role in your work. This is about being good at your job. And if you want to be a really good designer, you have to understand this stuff. You can really care about being inclusive and still not know that you're not doing it. You could not know that you are doing something that is preventing someone from being able to access something. I think that's the exciting thing about this book is that it's like a secret book. It's like a secret key to learning about this stuff. I wish that there was an easy way to just say, oh, it's just this, but
Mhm.
it's more of an experience going
Yeah.
through the process of reading this book and learning about these things.
I've heard you say if it's not accessible, it's not done yet when you're talking about the design.
I think that when we talk about accessibility and talk about all of the practical things we have to do to implement it, we use things like alt text and color contrast and that kind of thing. It is also thinking about, was this the right format in the first place? Was this the best thing for these folks? Are you even making a good design decision in the first place? And so I think there's like a bigger concept in the book about making better design decisions along the way when you start to think about people.
I believe this is a very empowering book, and I'm so excited for the community to finally have their hands on it and be able to just plug and play. But what are your thoughts?
I love that you talk about it being empowering because we spent a lot of time making sure that this book was set up in a way that it's like acknowledging the fact that none of us know this stuff until we know it. There are people in this book that are not, quote unquote, accessibility experts at all. They shared their stories about something that they messed up big time and then what they did differently to fix it. It really reinforces the fact that you don't know it till you know it. And then once you know it, it's like this whole world opens up and you think about all these really cool things that you can do. And so I hope that this book serves as a way to empower people to think about how they design and think about it a little bit differently and feel like they can actually do something about it. That is the big takeaway. It's you can do this stuff. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do. You just have to get in on the secret.
I love that. And it ties back to the book. I feel like you're going to be having conversations with all of our contributors, listening to their stories. Yeah. Well, hopefully our listeners are joining you in this journey, and we'll reach out to you and all the Design for All contributors on the site and through socials, and just keep chatting about the accessibility and inclusion work that they're doing. So thank you again, Sarah.